Indigenous Research. I'm Patty Loew. Well, it has been a year like no other, incredibly challenging for many of us. It felt at times as if we were groping in the dark, fearful for the health and safety of our families and loved ones, and trying to figure out how to teach in what had become the new abnormal, remembering to stay physically distant, but really needing to be socially connected. And we tried to do that through virtual open houses hosted by Jennifer and Pam, healing fires outside the CNAIR house that Pam streamed on Facebook Live. And somehow our CNAIR family made it work. The research happened, not exactly the way we thought it was going to happen, but with creativity, ingenuity, innovation, our community of scholars was able to achieve remarkable goals. Our undergraduate fellows were able to explore new ways of reimagining museums, rematriating ancestral lands, exposing environmental injustice, understanding vaccine intentions, and documenting a 35-year relationship with wild rice. Our graduate fellows tackled topics like Black Indigenous placemaking in Mexico, Indigenous ecological knowledge and disease risk, and Indigenous ways of knowing textiles. Our faculty affiliates celebrated completion of a digital project for the NACE College Library. We have affiliates working collaboratively with Native nations on traditional ecological knowledge and resilience, on COVID-19 research, on law and tribal governance. Fascinating topics, meaningful topics. This year, we celebrated the launch of our new Native American and Indigenous Studies minor under the capable guidance of Kelly Wisecup. Our wonderfully diverse affiliate base grew to over 40. CNAIR was the grateful recipient of an entire library of nearly 2,000 books, periodicals, chat books, small run, rare books, and papers donated by noted Native American Studies scholar and author Arlene Hirschfelder. And I saw Dennis and Arlene here. Thank you. It's lovely to see you, Arlene. We're so glad that we got to know you, that you made this wonderful gift, which we deeply appreciate. And we're excited because Arlene and her husband, Dennis, have allowed Northwestern Library to share in the collection so that the resource gets as widest possible use as possible throughout the entire library system. And we're very grateful to you, Arlene, and we're just delighted that you joined us for this symposium. We're grateful to friends like the Hirschfelders, to Dean Adrian Randolph and the Weinberg College of Arts and Sciences, to the Mellon Foundation, which supports much of our research activity, to the provost for her support, and to our Native and non-Native students who constantly inspire us. And I'm particularly grateful to Jennifer Michaels and Pam Silas, who represent the center in the best possible way, to our stellar affiliates, and to my beloved colleague, Kelly Wisecup, and to the Native communities we serve. We're really excited to share this celebration of research with all of you. Miigwech. And now over to Kelly.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for being here. And Patty, thanks for starting us off with such a wonderful welcome and opening. I am delighted to introduce to you the undergraduate fellows who will be presenting on our undergraduate research panel. They'll each give short, about 5-minute presentations, and then we'll have some time for questions and answers. So we invite your engagement and discussion of the presentations after. Haku Blaisdell is a Kanaka Maoli student from Aiea, Hawaii, studying education and social policy. Her research focuses on Indigenous interventions into the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago. This research and her passion for remapping museums was made possible by her mentors, Deborah Yepa-Papan and Miranda Roberts, to whom she's extremely grateful. After Haku will be donning Kosover-Ayala, And she's a senior at Northwestern University in the American Studies and Spanish departments. She's a student of African American, Latinx, and Jewish studies, with a particular focus on race making within the US, Latin America, and transnational and borderland communities. She's passionate about art making as a tool for social change, ancestral healing, transformative justice, and collective liberation. Danielle Kiefus, the next presenter, is a senior studying environmental science, science and human culture, and political science. This presentation on his science and human culture honors thesis stems from his interest in the environmental injustices of settler colonialism, corporate accountability, and the Southwest. And I'm very pleased to be able to congratulate Danielle virtually on winning the Science and Human Culture Essay Award, which we just learned about this week. Mae Maston is a Weinberg Junior studying computer science and psychology. Through her research for the undergraduate fellowship, she's been lucky to work with Patty Loew, the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, and CNAIR, and recently had the opportunity to travel to northern Wisconsin to visit the locations she's been studying. And then our final presenter will be Loew Guerrera-Trigo, who is a junior majoring in economics and psychology with a minor in mathematics. Loew is originally from Brazil and intends on pursuing a PhD in behavioral economics and decision science after graduating from Northwestern. On top of his work alongside Professor Hirsch on COVID-19 vaccination hesitancy among Native Americans, Loew has worked as a research assistant on topics such as early adoption of decision aid technologies, price perception and recall, and the effects of stereotypes on learning. Please join me in giving a warm virtual welcome to our undergraduate fellows, and we'll turn it over to Haku for the first presentation.
Thank you, Kelly, for that wonderful introduction. I am going to do the thing we all do. I'm going to share my screen really quickly. Oops. I don't think I shared the right thing. A year into Zoom and I still don't know how to work it.
I'm right there with you.
Okay, this is the one. Can everyone see my screen all right? Okay, great. Aloha kako, my name is Haku Blaisdell. As Kelly mentioned, I am a Kanaka Maoli student, focusing on the Field Museum of Natural History for my research. And when I was thinking about what to present for this time, I was like, I need to start from the beginning because this was a very long kind of journey getting into this project and this interest. So it kind of started in actually Professor Kelly Wisecup's class in fall of 2019. I was in her Native Literatures class and we took a field trip to the Field Museum of Natural History. And that was the first time that I had been there in years, probably. And they were just starting to embark on the big renovation of their Native North American Hall. And so prior to that, from like the 1950s to 2018, the Field Museum's Native North American Hall remained largely unchanged. They had represented Native cultures as artifacts of the past, frozen in time, and they were heavily decontextualized from the stories and voices of actual people. These images here I took on the field trip, and as you can see, there are faceless mannequins, little to no context of what these items meant or are. Many of them were adorned with cultural material and sacred items that probably shouldn't have even been out on display. So there were a lot of issues with the previous exhibit, and most importantly, the museum failed to acknowledge the thriving Native community present in Chicago today. So during this field trip, I came into contact with Deborah Yepapapan, who is the community engagement coordinator, or Native community engagement coordinator at the field. Started talking, and she's amazing. She's wonderful, and just I decided I would love to work with her. And so I reached out to her and Miranda Roberts, a postdoctoral fellow at the Field Museum, and asked if I could intern with them and help with any community engagement things that they needed. And they gladly said yes. part of their amazing work is facilitating these connections and bringing other Native people into the museum, letting them visit not letting them, but just facilitating these reconnections with ancestors who are trapped inside the museum archives, haven't seen people from their community in years, really. And so I was very fortunate to be one of those recipients of that work. So yeah, this is the Field Museum. And then the picture on the right is Miranda and Deborah and other Indigenous Filipino tattoo artists that we helped, that we worked with and got to meet and be in community with for a day. So this work is my research project is very much a continuation of the relationships that I've built during the winter of 2020 prior to the pandemic, getting to work with Deborah and Miranda and all of the wonderful Native people that we met along the way. So with, with Miranda and Deborah and Kelly, we kind of formulated a project to continue this work and continue this research into Indigenous interventions. Miranda Roberts actually helped to, and Kelly and Rose from the Newberry Library helped to coordinate a symposium on Indigenous interventions, which is very much like a big inspiration for my own work. I helped in a very small way. I made the Eventbrite. It was a wonderful Eventbrite, though, I will say. Top tier Eventbrite. But they really inspired my work. And so in thinking about how to continue it and how to make it field museum specific, we decided that I would meet with and connect with, build relationships with six different artists and community members and scholars who have intervened into the Field Museum of Natural History. So I had the pleasure of doing it virtually over Zoom because of the pandemic, but I got to interview and talk with several different artists. I had amazing conversations. It was really great just to learn from them and hear what this work meant to them. So some of the people that I got to talk with, Thomas Breeze Marcus, who in collaboration with Native youth and the AIC created this cosmic butterfly mural, which was absolutely beautiful. And definitely a testament to the ways that our communities remember and celebrate us, even in places like museums. One thing that this project has shown me is not only is the Field Museum a site of historic and ongoing violence against Native communities, but it is also a strong site of revitalization and resistance and community building too. Interestingly enough, a young 7-year-old girl came up with the creation story behind this beautiful mural. And it was just really a confluence of past, present, and future, and kind of, as Breeze described it, like it was something in her memory that had processed a contemporary creation story for 2019. I also got to interview Emily Johnson, who did an intervention taping over racial slurs in the Arctic Peoples Hall. Andrea Carlson, a wonderful artist whose work isn't just Field Museum specific, but intervenes across several different museums and kind of reverses the gaze and has us reflect on who museums are for. And then Chris Papan and his installation in the old Native North American Hall. And I got to talk with all of them and learned so much from them. It was very amazing. And I'm grateful for them making time for me amidst a global pandemic to sit down and talk about their work. So what came of this? Currently still in progress. We're on pandemic timeline. But I decided to make a zine and an accompanying website to serve as sort of a resource for Deborah and Miranda and their work in community engagement at the field. This is a very collaborative, generative piece, and I thought a zine would be perfect. They're meant to be highly accessible, passed around, drawn on, edited. It's a living document, essentially. And they look cool. So there's that too. but we're still in the process of making the zine, and again, heavily in conversation with Deborah and Miranda and folks at the field. And this will be available soon online. And yes, I just wanted to end with this photo of a, Miranda Roberts actually ended her presentation on Indigenous interventions with this photo, and I thought it was appropriate. It was a small can of dirt that Elder Grant Bulltail used in ceremony, and from that dirt, a sprout grew. And I just, that is so representative of Indigenous interventions and what can come from these meaningful reconnections with place and people and ancestors. Yeah, so thank you very much for listening to me ramble. I appreciate your time.
Thanks, Haku. Donnie is our next presenter, so we'll turn things over to you.
Oops. Okay, also going to share my screen. Thank you, Haku. Okay. Cool. Oops. Those are my notes. You're not supposed to see those, but that's okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Donnie. I'm really grateful to be here and to be in community with so many of you. Just want to say a particular thank you to Patty for being my advisor through this project, for really being a connector for me as well. One of the early connections I had was to Dr. Melissa Nelson. So thank you for that. So here's my project, Repair Through Rematriation, Redressing the Indigenous Ohlone and White Jewish American Settler Relationship. I think it might be a little helpful to just give a little context on why I felt compelled to tell this story. A year ago, about a little over a year ago, I road tripped from Evanston, from my birthplace, to Richmond, California, which is ancestrally named Huchin on Ohlone, Lishan Ohlone land, where my sister has been living for the past 7 years. And I ended up staying here for a year through the pandemic. And I felt compelled to tell the story, not only of the Ohlone and who they are, but also my role as a settler on this land and making home in a new place. And I felt curious, like, what, as a Jewish person, are there other Jews thinking about and wondering about being a settler in this place and being in relationship with the Lishan Ohlone and other Native communities in the Bay Area? And I found an answer. I just go to the next slide. I came in contact with this organization called Jews on Ohlone Land, who is a collective of predominantly white Jews of Ashkenazi origins, so of Eastern and Southern Europe, who have been living and making home in the Bay Area in Huchin for a variety of years. Some people are like third, fourth generation. Some people moved here in the last 2 years, and they prioritize solidarity and organizing work with the Segurate Land Trust. With Segurate Land Trust is an intertribal women-led land trust led by Karina Gould and Janella LaRose. They were founded in 2015, but those two have been organizing for the last 30 years to rematriate these lands. And so I started asking myself, what are the pathways for white Jewish settlers to be in relationship with Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island, and specifically, what are the mechanisms through which Jewel does that? Jewel is Jews on Ohlone Land, for short. So I just wanted to use this framework because this is Segurate's for community and for restoring ancestral land protocols and lifeways and mains, which, you know, the shell mounds across Uchin have been a priority for the past 40 years of Karina and Janella to really organize an intertribal group to rematriate these lands. And so this is the framework. It's specifically Indigenous and feminist praxis of building community and building solidarity to follow Indigenous lifeways. And this is where Jewel has found themselves as allies and as accomplices in this much longer struggle to return land and prioritize Indigenous protocols. So I just named here, I'm not going to go through all of this right now just for the sake of time, but this is kind of my framework for understanding. Let me close that. I name, this three-part problem of settler colonialism and specifically what happens for Jewish peoples as peoples that have earth-based heritages and have ancestral ways of understanding and rooting in place that were completely erased and not prioritized. Not only was there an invasion of and murder of Indigenous peoples here, but also simultaneously a complete erasure of Jewish ancestral practices, which ultimately leaves us in this place of deep violence and heavy trauma across the land. So I investigated Jewel's approach to forming solidarity with Sogorea-Te as both a political and spiritual platform. And I go a little bit more into that of why we must understand the political as spiritual in movements of Indigenous sovereignty and solidarity, and really investigating the lens of rematriation and traditional ecological knowledge, and what's at stake for understanding our relationships to all beings on these lands as an Indigenous vision. And two things that I found really important and special, not only for this moment of solidarity, but as a pathway for future groups across Turtle Island, Jewish settlers and Indigenous peoples to be in relationship, is for Jewish peoples to root in what Jewel has found as essential as teshuvah, meaning a practice of repair and return. It's also kind of translated as repentance, and radical diasporism, which is this concept that I take it from Melanie Kaya-Kantrowitz. She's a Jewish scholar and organizer, but many Jews have argued this for a long time in this place, that to be Jewish is to have a traveling homeland and to carry liturgy and texts and prayers wherever you go, and to be in right relationship with the native peoples of the lands that you land in as a historically displaced people. So I'll kind of end there. There's more to what my project really looks at, the ways in which Jewel has rooted in political strategies and then more spiritual strategies for being in solidarity, but ultimately I argue that both lenses are a necessary praxis for rematriating these lands and being what is called good guests, rather than only settlers on this place, but to be in right relationship with the Lashana Ohlone and much larger, the Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Dani.
Listening.
Thank you, Dani. Our next speaker will be Danielle Kiefus.
Hello, everyone. I'm also on my screen. I think I'm showing the right thing right now, so I'll go with that. Let's see. Very honored to be here. Very happy to hear about everyone else's research. It's really so cool. I'll be presenting on my senior thesis, Outrage and Inaction. It was a very meaningful process writing this, and I'm really thankful to my advisor, Professor Doug Keel, who's going to speak later, which I'm really excited for, and also to the Science and Human Culture Department and CNAIR for their help and support along the way. So my goal with this project was to situate the activities of the coal and uranium industries on Dene land in settler colonialism, and kind of use that understanding to push for tribal sovereignty. And being from the Southwest and holding those landscapes and that land very dear, it really changed my conception of home and of history. So I'm with a little bit of history of uranium and coal, and then talk about some themes of the project and pivotal moments, and then finally mention a trip I was very lucky to take. So first, uranium. That picture is from Monument Valley, looking south at some mesas where there used to be uranium mines. Uranium was a Cold War project with the US government as the sole buyer from the 40s until around 1971. Mining tapered off from there and was eventually banned by Navajo Nation in 2005. Because it's a radioactive material, uranium was solely regulated by the federal government. And meanwhile, labor and safety regulations for Dene miners were left to the states. And what that meant is that corporations that were serving the US war effort had discretion to treat their miners however they wanted. So there were just egregiously unsafe conditions in the mines. And as a result, there are very high rates of cancer in former miners. And then with the mines themselves, one of the craziest facts I learned in this whole research process came in President Jonathan Nez's testimony in a 2019 hearing. I didn't see it anywhere else, which is quite strange given the gravity of this fact. But the US government did not allow mines to be fully closed in case they were ever to need uranium for a war effort again. And so as a result, there are around 522 sites scattered around Navajo Nation, mainly in the Central Mountain Range and the Chusca Mountains and Monument Valley, and then also towards the east by Gallup. Only a fraction are cleaned up, mainly like the larger sites like the Church Rock spill, which is the largest radioactive spill in US history. And every few years, there's a hearing in Congress, and every few years as a result, the EPA releases a plan. And what I found is that each of the plans only studied the problem and they would send out research teams, they would employ a few people, but it's been decades and decades of not removing radioactive materials. And the total cost to do that is estimated to be like under 5 billion. So really small in the grand scheme of things. So to tie that to settler colonialism, it's a really disturbing instance of people being poisoned for money and lives being devalued in that way. Coal is very different. I'd say it's more polarizing than uranium, I found, because there's an upside in that it provides good jobs and revenue to the tribal government, despite the pollution it causes and the lies of corporations, such as by stealing water from the aquifer and refusing the that they're obligated to clean up. So it's it shows a more extractive aspect of settler colonialism in that coal is removed from Black Mesa. It's burned at power plants ringing Navajo Nation with the air pollution falling on Dene farms. But all of the power passes on power lines over some of the last unlit homes in the continental United States to power cities like Phoenix and Las Vegas. So there's very blatant energy inequality, and there's also blatant corporate misbehavior there. So to move kind of to themes, sovereignty really underlies everything with this topic, just having environmental self-determination and also economic self-determination. So I would say that contamination played more of a role earlier in my project. I was interested in how this landscape was selected to be treated as a wasteland. And that's a term that came up a lot. Government officials, I would read, they would say, no one lives there. It's a wasteland, it's hideous, which is just blatantly untrue. But I eventually shifted my focus more from decisions to justifications. Doing research during COVID, I found it to be more accessible and also very revealing in its own way, just how, because this happened out in the open, this was public, it wasn't secret. And so there's a lot to be learned from how it was explained away. I identified corporate actors as like the main point of contact of settler colonialism with the Dene people, because it was like company's mine manager saying, we're not going to install a fan in this mine that would blow out the unsafe radioactive dust. So that's kind of where a lot of the cruelest choices are located, the choices made for the sake of profit. But in the end, I moved towards a focus on governance because the government failed so spectacularly to clean up and to even follow its own conception of the trust responsibility. This story is just decades of budget concerns and murky jurisdiction and kind of passing issues around to just study them instead of fixing them. And so I ended up not concluding that the government should do a better job, like hold corporations accountable, hold itself accountable, but that responsibility needs to be entirely removed from the US government because it has had 70 years to do this even remotely right, and it won't. And that's why, like, the important conclusion I had is that these issues, environmental issues, demand tribal sovereignty. And so I'm a little over time, so I'll be quick, but at the end, this is the map of the road trip I was lucky to take thanks to the CNAIR Fellowship and a fortunately timed COVID vaccine. So I got to drive around Navajo Nation. There's a picture of Monument Valley I took. I like that picture not because it's the cliche mittens central photo that you always see in like Southwestern movies, but it's because if you look very closely in the shadow in the very center, you can see houses. And so as I was driving around, I realized like every single place I went, whether it was near a uranium mine, in the center of Monument Valley, or on top of a mountain, there were homes. And it was an important reminder that this is a homeland, and that means that it deserves sovereignty, respect, and health. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Danielle. Next up is May Maston.
Hi, thank you. I'm going to share my screen too. I'm super excited to be here. And I just got the notification that my internet connection is unstable as usual. So let me know if anything happens, but I will be back if I leave. Yes, I'm super happy to be here. I'm so grateful. This has been such a great project. And I want to thank Patty for all of her help. This has been such an ongoing thing. It's been, I guess, like a year and a half now almost. So it's just been such a good experience. And I've learned so much. And I hope you can see my screen. All right. So my project is about Manoomin in northern Wisconsin. And I will talk a little bit later about how I got the chance to go and see the sites that I have been studying this whole time. I wanted to start with this quote from the Mishomis book, which has been a good resource for me as I've been learning all about the history of wild rice and the culture, the traditions that are associated with it. So it is a sacred gift of their chosen ground. And I just thought that this was kind of a good starting point to give some context to why we think this project is so important. To give a little bit more background, this started as an undergraduate research grant and kind of has grown to what it is now. But the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, who we work very closely with on this project, has access to diaries of, they call him an outdoorsman, and he lived along the Wisconsin River in Rhinelander for a long, long time. And so we have like 30 to 35 years of diaries that he kept every single day. He recorded things like weather, he did hunting and fishing and trapping. And so just a lot of data about stuff like that, but a lot of data about wild rice, especially. So to start, we pulled all of the data out of the diaries and made kind of a database of specifically information about wild rice. So we have abundance and quality data and all kinds of things like that he just kept so meticulously for a long, long time. And so just as kind of some more background, we work with Glyphwick and we work with Munninghoff's daughter, who was the one who had the diaries originally and gifted them to Glyphwick. So we've been super lucky to have a lot of great connections with people who know a lot about what is going on with wild rice. Glyphwick, I think, wants to use the data in their studies because there is so much data in the diaries, and it is all really good data. But we also thought, and I think my next slide talks about this, that this was a really good opportunity to share it with other people so that people can understand more about what's going on with wild rice, and specifically how it's been declining in the last several years. So we decided to use a story map format, which I talk a little bit more about later. But we thought that this was the best format because we can incorporate all of these things that are super important. So place, and specifically where Munninghoff did this, where he harvested the rice, the data that we have, which is a lot of data, and then we can incorporate things like photos and just like stories from people. And I got to go on a trip to talk to Munninghoff's daughter and Peter David from Glyphwick. And I also interviewed Patty. And so we got a lot of information about the rice from people who really know a lot about it through interviews. And all of these things we can represent in the story map so that people can see them and learn more about them. This is just a map. So this is kind of what it will look like in the end. There will be a map in the background. And then you can click on locations on the map and people will be able to see information about each location. All of the things that were on the previous slide, a lot of like storytelling and data and information about the rice. And the goal of this was to make the information accessible and for people to interact with the place, and so that it becomes real, because when you think that this is happening far away and we are seeing declines in wild rice and you can't really see where it's happening, I think it is much less real. So the goal was for it to be very real for people. And then we wanted it to just be, because it will be in the story map is an online format. We just wanted it to be something that we could distribute to a lot of people and that people could use and understand everywhere, so that they know what is going on and understand the problems and the situation. But we really like the map concept because that kind of just ties it all together. And then I think I'm running a little short here, but I wanted to talk about the future of Manoomin. So what we found in the project is that everyone that we talked to and a lot of the data and just the impressions of people who work with it and really know it suggests that it is in decline, especially in a few key locations. Aliquash Lake is one that Peter David at Glyphwick is especially interested in because it really shows it was such a good rice lake for a long, long time. And now it's, I think, been reduced to almost nothing. So Glyphwick really wants to know why that's happening, I think. And it's important for us to understand that it is happening and look at some of the factors that go into that. So that's kind of where it is now. But for the future, I think everyone that I talked to said that they are hopeful for the future, but that something needs to change, or people need to be aware, or we just really need to know what's going on to know why certain lakes and certain locations and certain beds of rice are in decline. And I hope I didn't take too much time, and I will stop there. That's the very short version, I would say. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, May. That was great. Last but absolutely not least is Leo. So we'll turn things over to you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. So let me share my screen. Can everyone see the presentation? Okay, great. So yeah, so I'll be presenting on my research alongside Professor Hirsch. Really, the bulk of the research is a survey on COVID-19, specifically people's perceptions and people's kind of relationship to COVID-19 vaccines, but covering a broad kind of range of topics, including news, healthcare, and more. So really, I should preface the presentation by saying, first, I will kind of define the broad kind of scope of the survey. It's quite a comprehensive survey. And then I'll dive into the exciting world of methodological issues. Really, when you're talking about a survey of this size with such a specific population, there are several, concerns that wouldn't usually apply to survey-based research that I thought were worth mentioning here. But so that being said, let's go on to the first slide. So really the survey goals are twofold. We want to identify differences between those that are the support the vaccine, that intend on taking a vaccine, versus those that for whatever reason are either hesitant, resistant, or unwilling to take it, right? So that's kind of the core issue, I would say. But also, and this is where kind of a marketing-based kind of approach comes in. We also want to assess the effectiveness of different messages and initiatives in increasing trust in the vaccine and promoting, truthful spreading of information and really increase better the profile, the healthcare system. But so to that end, the survey topics cover, as I said, a wide range of issues spanning from vaccination history to related issues such as use of alternative medicine, to things like media consumption, where does most of your information come from, to healthcare use and obstacles. So are there concerns about cost, time, money, transportation to get to a healthcare facility? And closely associated, are there systemic challenges that are barring Native Americans from obtaining healthcare, from obtaining the vaccine possibly? Then finally, you have your host of demographic, information, demographic categories that might play a role as well. Now, the first kind of methodological concern with this survey is that we are talking about a non-random sample. And the reason why is because we are distributing the survey primarily through either Native news agencies, most notably Native News Online, and a host of organizations that have some kind of connection to one or more communities. And so while this increases the kind of the size of our sample, at this point we're close to, I believe, 1,000 responses, it does create problems when it comes to statistical analysis and the biasing of your sample. So the measures that we have taken, the first and foremost is to try and replicate language, try and replicate the structure of previous research on this topic. So with that, we can both compare results, but also make sure that our constructs, our questions are valid. So if we see a large discrepancy, that might indicate that the question wasn't received as it was intended, for instance. Now, on top of that, we also maintain a record of basically how the participant came in touch with this survey. So did they receive it through an email from a Native organization? Did they see it on the journal, the local newspaper, et cetera, et cetera? So we kind of keep a record of what we call the source of the participant, essentially, and that will be very helpful when it comes to segmenting the people. Then the second major issue is the construct multiplicity. So something like obstacles to vaccine, that can be someone's intention not to vaccinate or resistance towards the vaccine itself. It might also be, a lack of concern for COVID. It might be a practical barrier such as, transportation costs or other factors that I already mentioned. So here's kind of a diagram of how that expands from one kind of construct or rating that we're trying to analyze to kind of major issues to really a host of questions that we asked. So we could be talking about anywhere from 15 to 25 questions that could theoretically, with enough time and kind of complexity, be all aggregated into one measurement. So that obviously presents a host of difficulties. And then the final concern, and I think this is really key here, is since we are talking about the primarily small communities, they're incredibly kind of salient concerns about privacy and anonymity. So in that sense, we chose not to collect any identifiable information, but also we wanted to have the possibility to contact survey participants for follow-ups, for future studies, or even reporting of the data that we found. And so we created an associated contact survey. It doesn't link to the main survey, so it doesn't share the participants' data. We don't know where the data came from, but we now have kind of a list of names that we can reach out that are willing participants, that are willing to kind of maintain some sort of relationship with our survey or with our research at large. Now, a similar concern is when it comes to people who perhaps have older relatives who don't have their own devices, right? So ordinarily, when distributing a survey, you wouldn't want multiple responses coming from the same device. But the idea here behind creating a helper survey is that it allows those that that look after others that may not have access to either a smartphone or a computer to still take the survey, to still have their data accounted for. So yeah, that's kind of the extent of my presentation. Again, very short, and hopefully later on I'll be able to report on some of the results. But for now, I thought that the methodological issues and concerns were kind of extremely fascinating, and at least from my point of view, a great learning opportunity.
Thank you, Leo. Let's please congratulate these undergraduate fellows and their advisors on the wonderful work they did this year. Thank you for sharing this with us. I'm so proud of you and so impressed and so grateful to have learned from you and the work that you did. Really, really wonderful work. I want to give us a short break before our graduate student panel starts at 1:50. But before I do so, I would like to make a very special recognition. And to do that, I'm going to share my screen. We're really pleased that our Native Studies minor this year has our first graduate. And so we want to send a very special congratulations to Caitlin Rubenstein, who I know is here. Caitlin, can you unmute and give us a wave or a hello? Thanks. We're so proud of you, Caitlin. We're so happy to have had you in our courses and our program, and we wish you all the best. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you all.
So we now have a quick little break of just a couple of minutes before our graduate student panel starts. So please feel free to stretch, make sure to hydrate. We've got a couple of slides highlighting affiliate research for you to take a look at during the break. We'll come back, since it's about 1:50, we'll come back about 1:52, just a couple minutes past 1:50. Congrats again to Caitlin and to our undergraduate presenters, and we will be back soon. Okay, thanks for your patience, everybody. We are excited to get started with our graduate student panel. And as we do, I have a slide up that introduces next year's 21-22 CNAIR graduate fellows. I know some of them are here, so just want to say to you, thanks for coming to this symposium. Congratulations. It was such a pleasure to read your applications, and we're so pleased to be able to support your work. I also want to give a lot of thanks to Beatrice Reyes and Rose Myron for serving on the Graduate Fellowship Review Committee. We could not make our fellowship program run without you, and we really appreciate your help. I'm really delighted to introduce to you our 2020-21 graduate student fellows who will be presenting today. And I'll introduce them in the order that they'll present and then turn things over to them. So first up will be Ashley Ngozi Agbasoga, sorry, I've got a typo on my sheet. And the title of her talk is Against Empires, Black Indigenous Ontology. Ash is a PhD candidate in the Department of Anthropology with a graduate certificate in African American and Comparative Race and Diaspora Studies at Northwestern University. Her dissertation, titled We Dance with Existence, Black Indigenous Placemaking in the Land Known as Mexico and Beyond, illuminates how women who identify as Black and Black Indigenous engage in placemaking practices that reveal and unsettle notions of race, place, and modern state formation in Mexico and beyond. Our second presenter will be Bobby Benavides, who's also in the Department of Anthropology, and whose talk is titled Redefining Maya Health, Indigenous Ecological Knowledge and Metabolic Disease Risks. Bobby's research focuses on how Indigenous knowledge systems can mitigate the development of metabolic disease risks. She uses a case study from the Maya located in the Yucatan Peninsula, Mexico. Next up will be Cordelia Rizzo from Performance Studies. The title of her talk is Weave to Stitch, Indigenous Ways of Knowing Textiles. And Cordelia is an activist scholar and maker from Monterrey, Mexico. Her current doctoral project in performance studies examines textile making as a tactic to protest militarized state violence. This project delves into Indigenous knowledges and weaving to identify feminist and anti-colonial components of the protest imbricated in textile making. She focuses mainly on embroidery, since one of her main sites of protest is the Transnational Embroidering for Peace initiative, which began in 2011 to protest organized violence, the war on drugs in Mexico. And finally, Risa Puleo from the Department of Art History will present a talk entitled Reading Maps in Nahuatl. Risa is a fourth-year student in the Art History Department, and her dissertation follows the Iberian churro, a breed of sheep brought to the Americas from Spain, from central Mexico in the 1560s into Dene, Arizona in the 19th century. There, the wool of the churro was used to weave blankets, and through central Mexico, though central Mexico and Arizona are currently separated by the US-Mexico border, the presence of the Iberian churro in both places is evidence of ancient thoroughways that connected the Americas before the arrival of the Spanish and the imposition of colonial borders. So Risa's a work on a nonlinear art history that communicates the indigenous temporal and spatial logic of the places represented on 16th century Mexican maps and late 19th and early 20th century Dene weavings. So with that, I'll turn things over to Ash. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Let's see. Okay, I thought I would be great enough with Zoom. Okay, there we go, share screen. Desktop one. Oh, let's do this. All right, are y'all able to see my screen? Okay, great. So, Halito, great, good afternoon. Omenaha, my name is Ashley Ngozi Agbasoga, and my presentation today is called Against Empires, Black Indigenous Ontologies. I'll start off with what my dissertation is about and kind of ground us there. And then I'll speak briefly about what I've been working through for my last chapter of my dissertation for this quarter. Let's see, okay, great. The year 2019 marked several milestones for Black and Afro-Indigenous communities in Mexico. In April of that year, the Mexican Senate voted unanimously to amend the national constitution to recognize Afro-descendants throughout the country, following the 1992 constitutional amendments to recognize Indigenous peoples. The following year, Afro-Mexicans would be counted for the first time in Mexico's decennial census. 2019 also marked the third national meeting of Afro-Mexican women in Guerrero, Oaxaca, a predominantly Black indigenous Mexican town, hundreds of kilometers away from the shifts happening in the metropole of the country. During a break, an elder organizer commanded our attention with a discussion of danza chilena, an Afro-Mexican cultural dance. She says, quote, "Now, danza chilena has been quite popular nowadays. You can see it outside of the coast, even in Mexico City now," she began. "But no one does it like us. Bailamos con existencia, nosotros bailamos con existencia. We dance with existence, we dance with existence." What does it mean to insist in practicing existence in a place that has denied your very existence for centuries, and to do it on you and your community's own terms? And this is the central, I guess, question of my work. My dissertation, titled "We Dance with Existence, Black Indigenous Placemaking in the Land Known as Mexico and Beyond," eliminates how Black Indigenous and Black Indigenous women engage in placemaking practices that reveal and unsubtle notions of race, place, and nation statehood in Mexico. I focus primarily on Black and Indigenous women's organizations and collectives throughout Mexico in the wake of institutional recognition, in which they cultivate radical alternatives to bring long overdue socioeconomic shifts and ontological shifts, as I will say later, in their communities. I ask, how might understandings of race, place, and state formation shift when we bring Black and Indigenous thought together? Merging ethnographic and archival research conducted from 2016 to 2020 in Guerrero, Oaxaca, Veracruz, and Mexico City, with theories and methodologies from anthropology, history, Black studies, and Native and Indigenous studies, I argue that Black Indigenous placemaking practices create two critical ruptures. First, in the reproduced bifurcation of Blackness and indigeneity, and second, in the Mexican state's racialization of its territory as mestizo, which is in this case, the mixed European and Indigenous citizen. These ruptures generate space to think about alternative possibilities for Black, Indigenous, and Black Indigenous communities throughout the Americas. So what have I been trying to think up this past quarter? Well, this involves my last chapter, and particularly the first rupture that I mentioned earlier, and the reproduced bifurcation of Blackness and indigeneity. Over the course of, I guess, this last year inside, really, and lots of us have been on social media, I've noticed an uptick of folks on social media thinking about the intersections of Blackness and indigeneity. So we have folks like Amber Starks, who is Melanin Muskoki, who's amazing. Black Zapotec writer Alan Pelaez Lopez, etc. Right. And then on the scholarship end, we also have a rise of folks thinking about Blackness and indigeneity together, kind of bridging Black studies and Indigenous studies. So most famously right now is Tiffany Lethalbo King with the Black Shoals, but we also have Shania Cordes, who is Black Warawa from the nation state of Guyana. Who I think with particularly on her unsettling of settler colonialism, Kyle Mays, who is Saginaw Chippewa and Black, etc. And they follow in the footsteps of folks such as Tia Miles, Sharon Holland, etc. that have also been thinking about this for some time. So this intersection of Blackness and indigeneity comes up in my work on several scales. First, the rethinking of Mexico in the context of settler colonialism, which settler colonialism is often talked about in Anglo-speaking nations such as the US and New Zealand, Australia, etc., but not necessarily thought about in Latin America, which I think is actually really useful here to think through. Plantation logic stemming from Black studies and mestizaje. In Mexico being a state that adopts mestizaje basically as its national, I guess, identity, it can be argued in some ways as a settler colonial state itself, and had a very large plantation economy at one point. So I'm thinking of these together in the modern formation of the Mexican state. And I've also been thinking with scholars throughout Ayala, so particularly Glenn Couthard on the colonial politics of recognition, Simpson and Hurston on refusal, Hartman, McKittrick, and Mashana Goman on mapping, and then Varela Huerta and Mitan Zaleon on Black, Indigenous, and Latin American feminisms. But it was the women who I had the honor to work with for many years who articulated better than I or anyone really could on the ontology of Black and Indigenous relations with themselves. So I'll give a quick example. Leti, a woman who was born and raised in the Costa Chica, spoke during a group exercise that I was attending. And she says, quote, "Being Mixtec does not mean I am not Black. People tell me that it does, but to me, it doesn't. People do, however, always see me as Black until I tell them about my mother. Then they tell me I am not Black because I am mixed or mestiza. But no, I identify as Black too, because this is what I am and this is how people see me. And I am both, I hold both." This is my translation. So I'm kind of taking this and arguing that Leti's stance unsettles racial logics by the state that deems one as mestizo if a person is perceived to have mixed ancestry, right? According to this held idea, Leti is neither Black nor Indigenous, but mestizo, right, as part of the nation, and she refuses that. Her insistence on identifying as both Black and Indigenous, particularly with her nation or community, since in Mexico, there's different language around this, differed from the Moreno identity that other people took up, that some shared in the Costa Chica, which still implied a mixedness rooted in mestizaje that differed from one being Black and or Indigenous. I see Leti also refusing blood logics that mestizaje and other racial formation relies on, and instead using relation to identify herself. So I'll finish up. So in this chapter, I attempt to render collapsible the bifurcation of Blackness and indigeneity, or rather the ontological determinations of Black and Indigenous as separate classifications, a la Wilderson. With this attempt, I must also be attuned to the ways in which Blackness continues to evade legibility when in relation to indigeneity, as well as other racially relational terms. I base most of this discussion on both the historical foundation of the usage of these terms, as well as the refusal to both Mexico, national and US empires, a refusal from also blood logics and mixed raceness, particularly in Mexico and Latin American context as mestizaje, and which I argue, a refusal against empire. Thank you.
Thanks, Ash. Next up will be Bobby Benavides.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen.
Sorry, Bobby, I don't know how to stop share. Okay, frantically trying to get out of my window. All right.
Okay. Cool. So my project is titled Redefining Maya Health, so Indigenous Ecological Knowledge and Metabolic Disease Risk. And I use the word redefining in thinking about from the perspective of someone writing about health, someone engaging in health research, like how are we thinking about the way we are doing that, especially how are we writing about someone else's health? So this work, it's not going up. Okay. What is going on in the Yucatan Peninsula? What does health look like right now? And right now they're experiencing a rapid and severe rise in the burden of obesity, diabetes, and other metabolic conditions. And with that, you have this increased risk of mortality from these diseases. So cardiovascular disease, other heart-related issues. And so you have a 10.6 increase in diabetes prevalence and 35.7% in obesity, which are really high rates considering that this this research was over a 40-year time span. And so the socioeconomic transition in this specific cross-sectional secular health study looked at, you have the henequen plantation production, and then you have this kind of neoliberal rapid development move towards tourism in the area. And so we see the health trends associated with that shifting. So there's this phenomenon called coca colonization. So this is largely tied to neoliberal reform, capitalism, and another form of settler colonial violence. It's you have this introduction, consumption of drinks and junk foods, but I think it goes more into the aspect of tourism, right? So you have tourism coming into these areas, and it's also displacing indigenous folks from their land. And so they have these communal land-based tenure systems called ejidos that were this effort to give land back, but what it ended up doing was just pushing people to areas where they didn't have the proper soil to grow their foods, and it really limited access to subsistence-based foods. So on top of this, we have all these questions. How can we mitigate obesity and diabetes? Like what is going on here? There's this conversation about, should we be taking an upstream approach? Should we be taking a downstream approach? And upstream meaning, should we be looking at structural issues? Should we be looking at political economic factors? Or is this an individualized problem? People are still trying to push this Maya ancestry is the reason why they have such high rates of disease. But I would argue that what's missing from these perspectives is an indigenous one. So all of these efforts to get at health, to get at intervention, have been largely unsuccessful. And so I'm interested in understanding how indigenous folks are kind of mitigating these risks and like what is working, as opposed to this kind of long trend of this is the harm, this is what isn't working. So I think there's a lot of research on kind of these health issues, but very little on looking at how traditional dietary practices are a protective practice. And there's some in archaeological and historical literature, but I'm interested in understanding access as opposed to preference. So what does that look like now? And so I'm looking at that in thinking about indigenous ecological knowledge, which my case study in Ekbalam will kind of show how this plays out a little bit further. So I'm defining it as, or conceptualizing, not defining, as a dynamic body of knowledge comprised of traditions, beliefs, practices, and ideologies in their situated context. And with the help of my great friend and colleague, Danielle, and conversations I've had with her, using Watt's concept of place thought, so thinking about how, you're moving beyond just like land and being on land, but how spirituality and aspect in this, and cosmology, and how's agency, like what is the role of agency playing in this kind of dynamic. And then Patty Loew's concept of 7-generation earth ethics, and that's looking at this multi-generational approach to how we're caring for the land, and by we I mean indigenous folks, and this multi-generational approach to that. And then I think another important critique when thinking about health and thinking about public policy is to consider Agrawal's critiques of power and cultural context. And so a lot of Euro-Western approaches and frameworks to the integration of indigenous ecological knowledge often don't talk about these power dynamics, right? And so I think it's really been, the CNAIR community has really challenged me to think about what do I mean by integration, and what do I mean by thinking about these biomedical frameworks, and then thinking about indigenous knowledge. And so it's more of a foregrounding and backgrounding type of, I think, conversation that is to be had here. And so Ekbalam, so this work draws from my fieldwork experience in 2018. So I was an undergraduate at the time. And just as a disclaimer, I do not work with bees, but bees will be in this conversation. I am not a bee expert. I examine the relationship between people who have a relationship with bees. So if you ask me some out-of-pocket bee question, I probably won't know it. So Ekbalam is in the northern highlands of the Yucatan Peninsula. And My work there was conducted on oral history interviews with a combination of elders in the community who were landowners or ejidatarios. And so part of that neoliberal reform, they were given pieces of land and then displaced from their original homes and now live amongst each other and have like a communal system and also complex kinship relationships between the Pueblo of Ekbalam and then other surrounding pueblos. And this fieldwork experience is extremely important for context. Began 2 years after a meliponario was reintroduced into the pueblo. So meliponario is like a complex structure for beekeeping Melipona bees, because during land displacement, it disrupted the Melipona beehives and they often left or they just didn't survive. So this was kind of a reintroduction of that, a local initiative as well as just a conservation effort. And so in talking with mostly the children, honestly, would often take me around and show me how everything worked and teased me for my lack of knowledge of the local plants. And 3 women in the community, the women I think were harder to engage with because they were very busy. And going back, I would like to have more like their perspective. They have engaged with beekeeping quite a bit. So a little bit of background on beekeeping. Okay, so there is a thousands of year old relationship between the Maya and Melipona bees. And there's a cosmological connection and relationship to stingless beekeeping. So Melipona beeshii or Shunangkab in Yucatec Mayan are the native bee species that are local to the Yucatan Peninsula and other parts of Latin America. And you have this written about in the Madrid codexes that weren't destroyed during the Spanish invasion. And you have material culture that demonstrates, there's Melipona honey that has been in paleobotanical analyses, and you could still have this long withstanding relationship to bees, regardless of how settler colonialism has disrupted that relationship to the land, to the bees. That knowledge for the people of Ekbalam was still very much present, part of their worldviews. And so this is what a meliponario looks like. So there's 2 different types of beehives. So you have the more modern more modern hives on the left. And I don't know if you could see on the right, but you'll have what's called the jobones. And those are actually what is depicted in some of the codices, like the bee almanacs. And so that would be kind of Melipona make their own hives. So they'll just kind of inhabit like a drying log, and then you would go and cut the log and then take it down. And that was considered a very spiritual practice, and the best warriors were the ones who were going to collect these Melipona hives. And we would keep the tree intact as opposed to cutting down the whole thing. You would just cut the dry piece of log and bring it back to the community. So I think for the sake of time, I didn't want to go through all of it, but talking to conversations with community members and how they think about the use of Melipona honey, and they have just such an extensive wealth of knowledge that I've been so grateful that they shared with me. But Melipona honey is used for ritual practices still. It's used for, if they have cuts, it's used for pink eye, it's used for stimulating the breast milk of lactating mothers. It's used for everyday consumption. It's used as gifts to loved ones. And there's a lot of practices surrounding Melipona honey and just generally subsistence-based foods, which I don't have the data or research for, but I would like to in the long run. And so thinking about how that interacts with metabolic disease and how that interacts with health, there's a lot of literature now, especially from the Maori in New Zealand, and just their relationship with bees and honey as well, is there's a lot of interactions metabolically, biologically, with this downregulation of metabolic risk factors that contribute to obesity, that contribute to diabetes development. And so when thinking about intervention, we should be thinking about an Indigenous intervention. And some of these practices that, the states have disrupted and have limited access to, and just kind of taking a look at what is working in the community. There was one intervention study where they fed chronically malnourished children Malapona honey for the course of 4 months, and then they were no longer clinically malnourished at the end of that time period. And so just kind of like engaging that, like how we think about health, how we think about Indigenous knowledge. I think it's really important to situate that in like the specific context and engage with the communities that you're aiming to help. So thank you. I know that's like a quick run through. I'm trying to get through it. There's a lot more factors involved, but I want to thank primarily the community members in Nakbalam and the CNAIR community. I've learned so much in thinking through this project, and the Indigenous Grad Student Collective. So like all my best friends, I wouldn't have met without CNAIR. And yeah, and this is a little guardian bee. They're very cute. That was a very hard picture to take, but they like protect the hive and they pop in and out. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Bobby. Next up is Risa.
Hey, everybody. Thanks so much. Thank you, Bobby and Ash. It has been really wonderful to be in conversation with everybody this quarter. And I heard so many echoes of ways of thinking that I'm also processing and working through in my own work. This is a map that I found in the Newberry Library a couple of years ago. And when COVID happened, I kind of reoriented my research to prioritize local archives so that I could keep on working. And this is a map that is written in a pictorial language. Nawa was transliterated in the 16th century into an alphabetic language, but originally is written in pictures. So when we look at a 16th century map like this, our brains may be kind of conditioned to see this as an image, but in fact, it was equally a language, like a written language. And that is something that I'm trying to get back into, which requires kind of like a brain shift, especially as objects like these Mexica maps tend to be dealt with through Western art historical terms, where questions about hybridity, like so for instance, the church then becomes a signal of Spanish presence in the landscape, and art historians have spent a lot of time like kind of trying to parse out what is Indigenous and what is Spanish influences and where do they meet in the middle. And I'm trying to approach these maps in a really different way. What do they tell us about the land and native sovereignty in this area, in this moment in which you can see here, this particular guy who is this Iberian churro sheep becomes a foil, I think, for thinking through the landscape in a different way in my project. So in this case, this churro sheep was newly imported to central Mexico. This is 1560, and did a lot of work to depopulate the landscape of plants, which would over time aid in the, oh, where's my slide? There we go. Aid in the kind of unbedding and the destabilization of the Mexica-based infrastructure for this lake, which is obviously no longer in Mexico City. This is Mexico City circa 1492. And my map is looking at this area in between here. So I think that art historically, there's been a tendency to kind of try to understand how spatial mapping, Western mapping kind of maps onto Indigenous mapping. And I'm trying to read a different kind of mapping. which leads me to what I did this quarter, which was trying to map my project by writing 3 syllabi that I hope can lead me through the next stage of my work, and then also hopefully translate into syllabi that I can teach for classes in the future. So one of the ways that the project is trying to negotiate is thinking about how our history is laid out in a kind of linear time that is then gets placed onto spaces and maps like these. And I'm trying to think differently into the time of the land, into the time of the plant. And one of the things that happens is this guy, this little sheep, moves up the kind of pathway that once connected the Southwest and the Midwest, which I can show you now, follows the same pathways and becomes the sheep whose wool is used in Dene weavings. This is a mural from 1942 by an artist named Gerald Naylor, talking about the importance of the sheep, which was integrated into familial units as kin, and then became, there's my sheep, became the foundation of works such as this. Dene chief's blankets became incredibly high commodity values when settlers encroached into the American Southwest. And I'm trying to build a sort of commonalities between these kinds of 2 objects based on relationships that, again, art historians aren't thinking or tend not to think through because of the ways in which the field is divided by colonial boundaries. So for instance, this is made of sheep's wool dyed with cochineal, which is the same sort of, it's a pigment that is used from crushing a bug that grows in the nopal cactus. And that is the same pigment that is used to paint this map. So as I was saying, this semester I spent some time writing some syllabi, and one of the syllabuses would cover the sort of ancient area that connected Hohokam and Mexica tribes in these areas here, as well as to the Mississippian kind of regions that we live in. And I spent some time traveling to Cahokia and to some of the other mound cultures in the Midwest. I also wrote an ancient syllabus, sort of quote medieval syllabus, thinking about the triangulation between these spaces, and then a modern and contemporary Native American art that would speak to the 19th century to the present. And that is my time here. So I'll pass it along.
Thanks, Risa. Last but certainly not least, Cordelia.
Hi, I'm going to show a few images. So I wanna point out that this is one of the best spaces and most generous spaces that I have found for this feature of my project, but my project in general, and that I'm forever grateful for just pulling more out of this than always. I thought that this tiny part of weaving was going to be a very small thing, a passing curiosity, and it has become like very fundamental in my dissertation work. So as Kelly mentioned, and my project is on embroidering, but my research has been on weaving, because I had the experience of weaving a few years ago, and I felt that it instructed and it choreographed a very specific relationship to the land. I mean, the actual place where you're sitting and the space, the whole space, and to the way that people relate to each other while they're weaving alongside each other because it tends to be a collective endeavor. So I titled it Weave to Stitch because I will be focusing on stitching itself. I think that weaving has been something that has had much better people writing about it. And I chose two sites of focus for this quarter that have to do with mostly the relationships that I have formed and the networks that I have formed through the embroidering network that still protests the war and militarization. So weaving has also been used as a technique to protest militarized violence, and weaving itself, the techniques and the objects that are woven are also attacked by militaristic and extractive enterprises. So that was something that that was something that was pointed out in an article written by Gladys Tzultzul, a Mayanik Shield woman who is a sociologist and who happens to live in Mexico. And so I followed that thread, and yeah, this is a project within a project. And weaving is a focus of aggression because weaving stands for, and is identified as something that not only expresses, but is the weavings and comings of goings of the community. It is a formation of the community. So I gathered information onto weaving collectives, and I exchanged information, and I bought a couple of pieces because ultimately these are weaving collectives that are not necessarily protesting politically or just doing work in that sense as my other focus is, but selling the stuff is always about also preserving a livelihood and also like doing the work, the communal work of valuing your own weaving so that people can value other weaving as well. So there's a lot of solidarity also among weaving collectives the ones that I see. So I started talking to a person who acts on behalf of a collective, well, a selling platform and a collective of weavers in Guerrero called Nube Ciega, and they've been showing the relationship of the huipil, the cloth that is worn, the dress or the short shirt, to the makers, and of course also valuing very much, if you can see in the picture, the flower of Xochislahuaca and other types of animal and landscape imagery. So also helping very much to see the way that the making is tied very much to the scene and the scene where it's made, and also how it. I also like Guerrero because it is a land that is has been harassed continuously by military occupation as well in Mexico, and I love that. I'll show a little bit more. This is the maker. So it's Julia, who's a maker of the. So this is something that is also new, that we never see the makers of these wonderful couture collections. So Alfredo is a manager. He's also from Xochislahuaca, and he has been storing the techniques and the designs that show this landscape that I was talking about, and he facilitates the sale. So that one thing that I never take for granted how networks are happen, but one is helping the value come across, and of course. Him being in Mexico City, he's studying university, so he also is someone who brings stuff. So you can see a bit of. Then it's Malacate Taller Experimental, and I put a piece this is from the highlands of Chiapas, and I've been in contact with Carla Perez Canovas for some years now, and she's also the manager. I didn't speak. I want to speak directly to the makers in the future. I don't think I need to. Just now, not to disrupt them, because they're the most vulnerable. They're the ones selling their work, and they're the ones that are struggling as well. And I put a picture of myself with this dress because this is also a thing that Malacate has been sharing their network with other weaving and making collectives that have suffered from the pandemic and also from the earthquake. So this is from Oaxaca, actually. So Carla is an activist scholar, and she's been managing Malacate, bringing awareness also about how they make the clothes, very similar to the things that Alfredo does in social media. And they've become, well, they've resisted also. Chiapas also happens to be a space, and the highlands of Chiapas also happen to be a space where there's been much paramilitary activity. And I'm also struck, I'm following the lead, but I'm struck by the way, the clarity, the business ventures of all these spaces have, and also they're not very, the political sharp thought that they develop as well, while maintaining something that is so beautiful. So in conclusion, I'm interested in these textiles as well because they show, this one from the Altos of Chiapas, the fusion one, is showing rhomboids, and the rhomboids show the orientation to the 4 cardinal points. And it's a very characteristic design. And just focusing on the design and the way of symbolizing the space has led me to think that textile work, or not only Indigenous textile work, but Indigenous textile work can open up a way of seeing textile work in itself as a type of technique, and also a place-making technique that can really contest these the grip that colonial ways of seeing space have on us. And that is also vital to contest the way that that military interventions section the land and attempt to make the land useful and make it easily useful, and attack the land that is of the people. And even not only in these spaces where people are so connected with the land, but also in urban spaces where people don't want to be harassed by the military. So how these become objects that stand for, like Gladys Usul points out about weaving, reproductive labor. And the Core of White space, like people know and are able to not give up their space, and are completely capable of resisting the many masks of these extractive forces. So the weaving and the embroidering and the design and all of these comings and goings also of the business show that there is this capability of thinking, of forming networks, of showing the work, of not being shy about it, and of being also very much actualized in how textiles are being sold in other spaces, like also in Guatemala, in spaces like Hidalgo, how design is being protected as intellectual property as well. So it has been very interesting to interact with them and to see how weaving is so important to accumulate to the interventions that stitching will be. So this is all obviously stitching, but the piece is woven, and that this weaving is so complex and should always guide our interventions about. It is a very interesting space to draw, to see how people's interactions are made and are constructed as well, with this thorough, this sometimes very imperceptible, but very important way of structuring space and forming relations that is beyond what we can see at first sight. So this is where I leave it, and thanks for listening.
Thanks, Cordelia, and thanks to all of our graduate student presenters. We have just a few, like 2 minutes before the panel's supposed to end. And so I think what I might propose we do is take a little break and come back at 2:45 for the keynote with Doug Keel. and then ask all our presenters to come back and turn their videos on at the end after Doug's keynote, and invite folks to make connections across talks, to ask questions to particular presenters, whether undergrad, grad, or faculty, and so that we have a kind of open conversation and Q&A after the keynote, which will end about 3:15. I can only see a number of screens, but I'm hoping that that is okay with the folks whose faces I can see. Okay, thank you, Bobby and Risa, for the thumbs up. So we'll take a 5-minute break and come back at 2:45 for our faculty keynote. So I will see you all, have a couple of slides for you to watch while you're hydrating, and I'll see you all in about 5 minutes. All right, I want to welcome everybody back to the last panel of the day. In a few minutes, I'll turn things over to Jasmine Gurneau to introduce our faculty fellow keynote, Doug Keel. Just quickly, I wanted to say a quick word of congratulations to our 2020, I really cannot talk, I'm sorry. I have like a non-COVID cold and it is clearly getting to my ability to talk, so please forgive me. I really want to congratulate next year's, I'm not even going to try to say the date, faculty fellows who I've listed on the screen here. And I'm really grateful to Doug Keel and Kim Suisia for serving on the Faculty Fellowship Review Committee for this year. Congratulations to these fellows and many thanks to Doug and Kim for your help in reading files. It's now my great pleasure to turn things over to Jasmine Gurneau, who's Manager for Native American and Indigenous Initiatives in the Office of the Provost, who is going to introduce Doug Keel.
Poso Mawanoayak, Yago Jawalin Yungyat, Jasmine Gurneau, and Suisian. Hello, everyone. I'm Jasmine Gurneau. I'm Oneida and Menominee and serve as the manager for Native American and Indigenous Initiatives. I first just want to say how impressed and inspired I am by all the important research questions that all the students have been exploring this past year and beyond. And it really has been a pleasure to hear about all of the work, albeit a brief summary, I'm sure. So just thank you to everyone for presenting and sharing this afternoon. It's my honor and privilege to introduce my Haudenosaunee relative and this year's CNAIR faculty fellow and research symposium keynote, Doug Keel. Doug Keel is an assistant professor in the history department and Kaplan Institute for the Humanities. He studies Native American history with a particular interest in Great Lakes region and 20th century Indigenous nation rebuilding. I also want to share congratulations for winning the Western History Association's 2020 Gibson Award for Best Article of the Year on Native American history for his article Nation versus Municipality, Indigenous Land Recovery, Settler Resentment, and Taxation on the Oneida Reservation. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you so much, Jasmine, for the nice introduction, and for everyone for organizing today, and for everyone presenting their work. It's really a joy to join this end of year conversation, especially because I was counting as folks were presenting research, and 6 out of 9 of you fellows have been in my classroom at one point or another. So it was really great to see a bunch of former students, to see projects I've had conversations about, heard a little bit about, a couple of years ago, and in some cases, maybe more than a couple of years ago. And it's exciting to see those things evolve. And of course, we look forward to continuing to support those projects as they develop. So I will get started by sharing my screen and probably messing that up, but let's go. Are people seeing a PowerPoint in front of them? Okay, cool. So my goals for today is outlined here. I've already started on the first one, which is first to gush about our awesome CNAIR students. Again, so great to see projects in development, and and I hope to continues to grow. Other goals that I have, as I share with you this afternoon, is effectively engaging with an important central keyword in our work, right? That all of us engage with different types of questions of sovereignty. And I want to speak to what I see as some of the values of our CNAIR community, and what's so great about everything that's being brought together here year after year in our symposium. Then I'd like to talk about fun museum things. And then I'd like to end off with a little bit of sense of sort of doing I guess what I do best, which is talking about legal and political things, mostly of the past, and our trajectory as they connect to the present. So I'll talk a bit about that and the things that are happening relatively recent-ish in the court. So one thing I want to start with, just thinking about sharing work over the past year, right? As a faculty fellow, so one of my goals is to show you a project that actually saw the light of day within the same span as the calendar year of that I was a fellow, which rarely happens. That something actually goes to publish in the same year that it's written. And I want to talk a little bit about the context of this piece too, as something that I think is maybe interesting in certain ways for thinking of sort of professional development kind of questions, and that there was an interesting invite. This invite first went out to a dear friend, Christine DeLucia, a historian at Williams College, and this piece that I'm just sharing the front page from is for the Organization of American Historians' magazine, which is effectively for the OAH, as it's called, effectively their arm that tries to engage more K-12 teachers, for instance, in the profession of teaching U.S. history. And Christine thought, rather than making this a single authored essay where she jumps in to chime in on defining what is this concept of Indigenous sovereignty, right, and what has it meant over time, she had an interesting idea, an idea that I think represents the kind of thing that we, try to prioritize and like doing at CNAIR, and we can see in different ways, present in all kinds of projects that we're doing, which is thinking collaboratively, right, and working together across different kinds of fields and across different kinds of questions, right. And so in this case, our invite was to consider big questions of Indigenous sovereignty writ large over the scope of U.S. history. Over a long scale, bringing together folks whose inclinations in history and American studies vary, but it was a productive conversation, one that allowed us to encapsulate a much greater range of voices, rather than offering like the single answer. Right? As we think about questions of Indigenous sovereignty, before I go into just sharing a few notes about how we structured this particular piece and how we decided to move through it, first to dwell a little bit on our own ideas, right? Our own language, our own concepts, right? We often use sovereignty as a shorthand, right? It's a concept that is rooted in European intellectual traditions, right? And we embrace it as something of a shorthand for really what we're expressing are our own ideas, right? And so I think it's important to start there, right? With first, we needn't necessarily invent language to describe this, this right to self-governance that we have, right? And this is what I share here isn't language that points so much to self-governance, more specifically, but I do share it as a more in-depth example of simply acknowledging the depth of our intellectual traditions, right, and our political histories as well, right, and to understand what you see here is Oneida Philosophies of the Good Mind. I keep this framed in my home. Outlines an entirely different national philosophy, right? Danny earlier referred to Patty's work on 7 generations philosophy, right? So much connected, right, to these kind of ideas we see here. I'll just walk through and I'll take you through my poorly pronounced Oneota'aga, but for the sake of sharing, the first is Kahle Jalusla, the heartfelt encouragement of the best in each of us. The next is Ganalu Kwasla. The next is Gatmigulio. The next is an interesting word I can't pronounce, so I'm not going to try it. I'll mess it up. The next is Galiwio. The next is Yukwa Wachile, and the next is Yukwa Chistaya. And so thinking about our approach to this piece, which is meant to be, popular magazine piece, goes out to all kinds of K-12 teachers who presumably, the point is, don't know much about Native history, don't really know where to start, right? But are interested in taking up some of these basic questions of Indigenous sovereignty, right? And so the way that we approach this is, we began first with thinking about what are important common misperceptions, right? And so we consciously decided to write the essay to those kinds of points, right? What are the things that we're constantly seeing in our classrooms being misunderstood, right? In my own case, it was pointing to ideas, for instance, of a certain sense of inevitability, right, of decline, pushing against those kinds of things. In other cases, pushing against a narrative that is maybe one that is, perpetually a progress narrative, right? That could be critiqued to greater degrees. But, consciously beginning by thinking of what are the common mistakes we're seeing in the classroom. Let's just go straight for those things from the get-go. And so we began with what is now a classic, a comedy classic in Indian country, George W. Bush's video from 2004, I suppose, when he was running for re-election, right? Him trying to define tribal sovereignty when asked by now editor of Indian Country Today, Mark Drahan, and then he fumbles through it. And the place we begin with is, the hilarity of George Bush is not only his fumbled response trying to define sovereignty through saying the word sovereignty 6 times, but pointing to, even in that fumbled response, he manages to say tribal sovereignty is given to you, and in expressing that very notion, right, that it's given, right, already expresses an important misunderstanding, and one that I always insist that we be clear on, because rather than interrogating what is indigenous sovereignty, there are certain ways in which you can maybe argue that it could be more productive for us to interrogate U.S. sovereignty, right? What is its basis, right? What is its supposed claims to the continent? Because those are the ones that are new, right? And so for us to emphasize that, really to understand that U.S. sovereignty comes from indigenous people, right? It comes from making treaties with us. And through that power, right, of indigenous people making treaties with the United States and other nations, right, the United States gains that sovereign recognition from our nations, right? Not the other way around. And that generally is the fundamental way that we begin that conversation, right? One of recognition, right? So from the point of view of Haudenosaunee people, right, with our great law of peace that roots to as early as perhaps the 13th century, right, a constitution with 117 articles, complex systems about how the different clans relate to one another, right? That system, that political system, chose to recognize the United States, right? Chose to grant it some degree of sovereignty. So even in the laughable George Bush fumbling, right, which represents a very simple common mistake, already there's a fundamental error about where it came from in the first place, right? But another thing for us to think about, as an important, just conceptual basis, right? A lot of what we ended up trying to do in the essay is so acknowledging first, right, its origins, and also coming to acknowledge that for Europeans, this is an idea that is so often really tied to the idea of what they're often promoting as civilization, right? Not everyone gets sovereignty. Not everyone is worthy of sovereignty in the European imagination, right? And so already it becomes, if we're to look to foundational pieces such as Joanne Barker's classic introduction to her edited volume, Sovereignty Matters. If we're looked to these early conceptions, we are to understand that there is an important way in which European conceptions of sovereignty are based on the denial of it to other people, right? And this is a familiar argument that, for those of us working in Indigenous studies, we see. Think of, for instance, Jeannie O'Brien's work in the book Firsting and Lasting. This is maybe not familiar for those who don't work in history, but it's about a process of how exactly is it that Native people become erased from history over time, right? And so much of that process, the drive for it is that Americans are establishing their own claim to modernity, right, by denying it to Native people, right? We're modern, you're not, and that marks the distinction. And tied to that also is these distinctions between being civilized and uncivilized, right? And also circulating around that are these questions of sovereignty, right? As Europeans, imagine that's to say. And so one of the things we wanted to do too was to, because they become so fixated and territorialized, right? They become so firmly rooted and tied to the land in ways that are really important, right? And central to everything about us, right? But at the same time can be constricting, right? So to think about what is it to recognize the importance of the land-based and conceptions of sovereignty, right? But also, how do we recognize, that we don't want to constrain ourselves inside of it, right? And another thing that I think is an important consideration as we're to think about, this is, a connection between how we link Indigenous studies and ethnic studies, right? Which is to say, one thing we often do as an easy shorthand in Indigenous studies is we refer to what makes our experiences distinct, right? In the experience of US ethnic studies, what makes Native Americans distinct is we're sovereign. We have governments, right? We have treaties. It's different. We're not internalized minorities. We are our own governments, right? Well, we're recognized, right? And I think it's an important distinction to identify that that's what that is, that we're recognized, right? And I'm saying that because I want to push back against the notion that sovereignty belongs to us in our field, right? Because that seems to be what that is saying, right? What makes us different is that we're sovereign, right? But in so many ways, if we're to extend the concept of sovereignty, as so many of us do in our work, right? To encapsulate things like food sovereignty, right? If we're to understand that and to expand the term, right? Doesn't it then necessarily open up the possibility of understanding that other people too are entitled to forms of sovereignty that are simply not being recognized, right? And so if we're to think about the important questions of what is it that Black studies and Indigenous studies can say to each other, and how can they support one another, right? One of our core struggles being, right, how is it that Indigenous studies, through its discourse of decolonization, can actually speak to the concerns, right, that are coming out of questions of Black studies, right? And I think that's maybe one way where we can do that, right, is to loosen up on the idea that sovereignty as a concept is the one that belongs in Indigenous studies, and it belongs to ideas of self-governance, right, as opposed to an innate set of rights, which is always what we're getting at when we refer to sovereignty being inherent, right? So that's to say, if it is inherent, is it then so unique and special to Native people, right? No, what's unique and special is that it is recognized, that there is a system in place, right, that has recognized that. And we have treaty record that do that, right? And a body of law over 2 centuries plus that manage that relationship, right? So I think that's one important thing for us to think about, is where Indigenous studies sits in regards to ethnic studies and its relationship specifically to Indigenous communities, or how we can think about it, having wider implications. Again, if we're to support visions of Black nationalism, we can import conversations about sovereignty into them, right? Giving one such example, though I'm no expert in African American history, and in the literature of James Baldwin, he refers to Harlem as occupied territory, right? So in these important ways, we can point to ways in which there are overlapping discourse, and I think that's important to recognize. I may be making it sound like that's all in the essay. It's not. That's actually a sidetrack, but an important point, I think, for us to thinking about, this foundational concept, right, that shapes so much of our work, right? We address the ways in which sovereignty is expression, turning to performance and art. One interesting example I'll share. We only speak to it briefly, but it's more detailed in Michelle Raheja's book, Reservation Realism. But an interesting story about a group of people who came to call themselves the Demille Indians. That is a group of Native actors at the beginning of the 20th century, right? There was such a large group of Native actors amassing in Hollywood in the early 20th century that they began to think of themselves as something of a political group, right? And it might sound kind of silly and laughable. Oh, haha, they thought of themselves as a tribe of their own, right? As people who work for Cecil B. DeMille, right? The DeMille Indians. Well, in the 19th century, we see things that are not so different, right? The idea of people coming from all different corners to reorganize themselves and gaining sovereign recognition as such, right? If I'm to think of the history of my own nation, the Oneida Nation, we took in the Stockbridge people as refugees in our territory in New York, and the Stockbridge people are a conglomerate of more than a dozen New England area, filled with individuals from more than a dozen area New England communities, right? Coming to form a new national identity, right? A new national identity as Stockbridge people, and are now a federally recognized nation, the Stockbridge-Munsee Band of Mohicans in Northeast Wisconsin. So thinking about sovereignty too is something that's fluid, right? It's pointing to, for instance, in Indigenous studies, one of our core theorist Chris Anderson at the University of Alberta has written a piece, and I can't remember which volume, on urban indigeneity, but has made important arguments pointing to the possibilities of how we might think of urban communities themselves, right? As we live on the edge of a massive urban native community, urban communities themselves having rights to sovereignty, right? And again, thinking about the difference between sovereignty as being an innate right versus it being recognized, right? So talking about sovereignty as an innate right, belonging even to urban diasporic communities, right? So something like the chapter of the Demiel Indians might sound like a silly invention, the idea that people would move to Hollywood and invent a new community, but that's not so unfounded, right? And that's not so distinct from some of the kinds of things we're trying to do here as community, right? And that's to say that part of what we're doing as the work of sovereignty is what I'm getting at, right? Moving things along, one thing I want to highlight, just thinking about sovereignty taking many different forms, right? And understanding the ways in which it intersects with with our environment, but also thinking about very small day-to-day actions, right? So I'm thinking about the excellent research that Danielle Kiefus did on his senior thesis on extraction on Navajo lands, and there's a great video, Vox video about water contamination issues in the Navajo Nation. And one thing we see in this in this video is a grandma going around in a water truck, right, to deliver to folks in the community who need it, the clean water that's otherwise not available. And so I think it's important too that we all appreciate, especially as we think about, right, all the hard work we do as a CNAIR community together, the ways in which the work of sovereignty is these small actions, right? Grandma getting in the water truck to make sure that the neighbors have what they need. And I have this little image here of June Henkwa, spring tilling services available. This is the Oneida Nation. I just like to brag on some of the creative ideas that I think we come up with. This is one very practical way of supporting food sovereignty. So what does the Oneida Nation do to encourage you to sustain yourself growing your own flourishing farm? They'll come by with their own equipment and till your garden for you, right? They facilitate making it happen, right? This is one way of using our sovereignty, right, to address these things that that so many of our fellows are talking about in terms of health, right? A next thing we do, pointing to CNAIR values. One of them, public engagement, right? Work that intersects with public needs and is speaking to the concerns of the day. So one thing I'll share with you about, we heard some great stuff about the Field Museum from Haku, who's had such a great experience there, and I know folks are very appreciative of her role at the museum too. So I'll share with you a little bit of a preview. I don't entirely know if I'm authorized to be telling you these things, so let's hush a little bit. So Patty and I are both on this advisory committee for the Field Museum, and as you heard from Haku, the idea is gut the whole previously existing exhibition that is older than my father, put up in the 1950s. And just to talk you through a little bit of the basics of how we've structured this thing, which is maybe supposed to be a secret until it opens spring 2022. But so I'll tell you just kind of the basics again about approach, format, much like I did with talking about the essay. Thinking about how we approached a project and how we engaged it, and especially in terms of thinking about public impact, right? So the task is, because the Field Museum has a comprehensive collection that spans the continent, that spans the globe, really. The idea is to do a comprehensive exhibit on Native North America, right? I think our first inclination was, let's do a really big and really cool Chicago exhibit. And an interesting consideration comes into play as we think critically about museums. It reminds me of a comment that I think comes from Amy Lone Tree. If maybe conversationally or in one of her essays, that the ultimate aim of the museum is to stay open, right? And thinking about how much that drives the nature of how the process works, right? So that's to say, if the first idea, what would be a great exhibition, the unanimous answer was almost immediately, do something all Chicago, right? But since the goal of the museum is to stay open, right, to show people its collections, to, to justify why it's there, and these kinds of things. So it's engaging in a whole process of trying to rethink what it does, how it does things, right? It's in so many ways, it's has a potential to be thought of as a kind of refounding of the institution, and ultimately rethinking its relationship with its established first partners. So as we think about the challenges of how on earth do you speak to, in any sort of comprehensive way, right, the experiences of Native North America, and I should note, we say that, but North America, which should include Mexico, and the imaginary always is Anglo-North America, right, the US and Canada. That ends up being the way that the museum is organized, which is things to be said about that too. But how we manage to organize, right, doing something comprehensive is through settling on 6 core Native truths, as we called them, right? And they are as presented here, that our ancestors, and also thinking about the museum objects, treasures themselves, connect us to our past, present, and future. Native people are everywhere, meaning in a variety of ways, right? Socially, politically, but demographically, right? Are everywhere. That we're deeply connected to the places that we're from, no matter where it is that we might happen to be, right, at present. So thinking of the landed natures of sovereignty, right, but how we also extend beyond it too, right? Next is we have the right to govern ourselves. For this one, we highlight on stories on wampum, for instance. One way that we speak to this is we focus on considering that it is a natural history museum. Our approach to engaging this kind of question, like making it relevant. What are we doing in the Natural History Museum, right? A question like we have the right to govern ourselves becomes a set of stories about wampum, and it becomes a story about the natural history of wampum, right? And it becomes a story about Haudenosaunee relationships, right, with where the shells come from, right, and what the stories associated with how it is that we gather them, how we make the beads, right, and of course the profoundly important meaning of what happens when we put all these beads together to make the messages that we do. The 5th truth is one that we insisted on being in there, and I one of the things I'm most interested to see how it plays out, because we insisted that this new exhibition will spend a significant amount of time talking about the Field Museum's own past harmful collecting practices, and we're going to be speaking about the repatriation of items to the Innu people in Quebec. And then I'll next mention a bit about the section that I've been most involved with and excited about. We speak for ourselves. But in addition to these 6 core permanent Native truths, we'll be having 4 rotating stories. And that will be a way of addressing that this should never really sit in a state of permanence ever again like that, right? So 4 continuously rotating stories. In terms of we speak for ourselves, one thing that was really important to me thinking about this exhibition is, so in a variety of ways, the institution's impulses is thinking about, right, what this new exhibition can offer its visitors, right? And when it thinks about its visitors, it means 98% non-Native people, right? What does this new exhibition offer to them, right? And already that's kind of a problematic way to begin thinking about it, right? So one thing that was important to me from the beginning is thinking about what are certain ways in which we can offer something that challenges us in Native America, right? What are some of the ways in which in a museum exhibition can not just be, we're saying nice things about you, you should be grateful, right? But that the educational space can be primarily driven by speaking to the things that we need to have conversations about in Indian country, right? And one of those things I think is, speaking about questions of our own internal diversity, right? Which is to say the representation of our Black relatives and our queer and Two-Spirit relatives, right? The 2 individuals featured here, Stormy Weber on the left, a poet based out of Seattle, and on the right is Geo Neptune, a basket maker from Maine, and they'll both be prominently featured in a section entitled "We Speak for Ourselves," which is an opening section well, there's 2 openings, one at each end, but it serves as an opening or a conclusion. Lastly, I'll revisit a previous work, and I'll talk a bit about it because I'm remembering that now that this case is over, I can actually talk about it. So some of you know that I've been, involved with legal work in the Oneida Nation over the past years, and I've spoken a lot about cases that came before it, right? But actually, for this article that did so well, I couldn't say next to anything about this current case, and I was able to get about 8 words out, just acknowledge that it exists, and then had to move on, right? So the nature of this case, I'll just very quickly tell you about. The Oneida Nation has been engaged in a century-long process of buying back the lands that fell out of ownership after the devastating policies of allotment, and first passed in the 1880s, implemented in the 1890s. By about 1930, the reservation has shrunk from 65,000 acres down to, depending on different measures, 200 owned in the hands of tribal individuals, maybe, I should say 2,000 acres maybe owned by individual tribal members, 200 actually held in trust. And so that's an important component of what this case was about. And to make a very long, complicated story short, it's basically about how close to zero it got, but it never got to zero, and the significance of it getting that close to zero. And this is connected to the important McGirt case out of Oklahoma, which is ultimately where I'm building to, and to point to how this case I was working on with Oneida Nation is connected to the big questions of McGirt, and why it gives me a sense of optimism about where things are headed in the future of Native law, which is not a thing I say very often. So the basics of this case. Again, there's a set of political conditions in which we're buying back property, placing it back into trust, right? So every acre of reservation land that is reacquired inside the reservation and then placed back in trust through the Bureau of Indian Affairs, that means it's pulled out of the local tax base, right? So that means the local municipalities cannot use that money on which to sustain themselves, right? So the Oneida Nation, every acre it buys up the municipalities out of existence. Again, they're inside our reservation. That's the nature of this complicated relationship. And so where this case originated was over a fall harvest festival called the Big Apple Festival. The Oneida Nation gets together in the fall, apple bobbing, hay rides, family activities, all kinds of fun stuff. And it's a rather large scale event, and one in which the Oneida Nation had to block the road. And as so many conflicts, it seems, in federal Indian law and policy turn out, blocking a road seems to be one of the biggest prompts for heading into court over who has legal authority over what, right? And so the Oneida Nation blocked a road, and the argument became that they didn't have adequate police and protection and safety in place, and then also that some of the land is on trust land and some of it's on privately held land. Very complicated stuff. But to point to some of the basics of what this case was about, the idea of the argument was trying to make a case that about what we call diminishment, which is basically, so as a piece of land falls out of trust status, right, after it was allotted, the question is, does it come back or not? Can it come back, right? After it's been allotted and fallen into a privately owned title, how does it come back, and can it come back, and to what extent, right? This is what all these questions are about. The Indian Reorganization Act of 1934 opens up the possibility to the reacquire of reservation lands, right? It ends allotment, which is implemented in 1887. In 1934, the IRA opens up the door to, you can start buying back land. And the amount is minuscule at first for most communities, including the Oneida Nation. But then you fast forward 75 years, and for some communities, the Oneida Nation in particular, the pace of recovery is dramatic and rapid, right? It comes to completely upend the local political climate. And to just to wrap up very quickly, I'll only point to a sense of what gives me optimism about how this connects to McGirt, and why I think it's worthwhile to have an optimistic sense about the Supreme Court in the years ahead. So the McGirt case out of Oklahoma was much the same kind of question. Did the Oklahoma Enabling Act actually dissolve the boundaries of the Creek Nation's reservation in Oklahoma? Well, that's a very simple question to answer. Either the boundaries were disestablished or they were not, right? Show us the document where this happened, that Congress says they disestablished it, or it doesn't exist and that didn't happen, right? And so much of these cases are about the implicit, what is happening, right? So the Brett Kavanaugh argument in this case in McGirt is, yeah, but white people have been living on the territory in question for so long, doesn't it just kind of become white people territory after a while? That it's not native and sovereign? It's been inhabited by non-native people for so long, right? Some sort of a magical effect, right, that the demographics have on the reservation. And this is referred to as the Indian character of the reservation, right? And these things used to, and I emphasize used to, play pretty prominently into these questions of were the boundaries of the reservation diminished, right? So when they can't point to, yes, Congress did it, right? It's clear that they did. They point to, well, implicitly, they meant to, or these conditions resulted in quietly at some point, the boundaries of the reservation shrank, right? When exactly did that happen? Nobody makes a claim to when it happened. But at some point between 1900 and 1920, this magical event happened and the boundaries of the reservation shrank, right? Effectively because too many white people inside the reservation, it can't possibly be reservation anymore, right? Bizarre logic, right? And it's a logic that is not based on political sovereignty, but is a logic based on ideas of race, right? Getting into the character of the reservation. So that is to say, it doesn't matter if the reservation was 99.9% inhabited by not Oneida people. Point is, we have a treaty from 1838 that says that designated chunk of Wisconsin is the Oneida Nation's territory, right? You can allot it, you can deforest it, you can build towns on it, you can do all things to it, but none of that changes that it's still the Oneida Nation's territory. And so the McGirt case, to finally wrap up as I'm rambling, the McGirt case takes up this very simple question. Did the Oklahoma Enabling Act dissolve the boundaries of the reservation or not? No. And so the court's decision is emphatically simple. The question is, was this agreement changed in any way since it's been made? And the court looks to it and says, no. So then we have every reason to simply hold them to their word. The idea that Neil Gorsuch simply expressed the idea that we should hold the United States to its word in making treaties is something that was called the most important federal Indian law decision in half a century. And it is still that, it is that. But in so many ways, it shouldn't be earth-shattering because all Neil Gorsuch says, and emphatically so, you can tell that he's trying to point it out. Duh. The treaty was made, nothing has changed. Of course it stands, right? It took until 2020 before the Supreme Court came to that simple conclusion, right? And what I would point to is that in 2005, a very similar case, and I won't go into the details, but a very similar case didn't go quite that way. And it re-invoked questions of the doctrine of discovery, which was all kinds of concerning and ugly. But in 2020, we see a different sort of move, right? It's a simple point, but it is one on which we can build an entire legislative future, right? On this emphatically simple decision. The agreement was made, it stands, period. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks, Doug. That was amazing, as always. Could I invite our graduate and undergraduate fellows to turn your cameras on if you feel comfortable doing so, and if not, that's okay. And then invite the audience to ask any questions of Doug or of any of our fellows today. Feel free to respond to Doug's talk, but also feel free to connect the talks or ask anything that has come up for you across the day. Feel free to put things in the chat and I can read them if you'd prefer that, or feel free to raise your hand, whether that's your actual hand or the Zoom hand. I figured this might happen. So I was thinking about the ways that Doug's, I can get us started with a little something maybe. I was thinking about the ways that Doug's kind of summary of some CNAIR ethics really encapsulated a lot of the work that the undergrad and grad fellows were doing. So it's great to see that kind of alignment happen. And so this is just kind of an open-ended question, I guess, for any of the grad and undergrad fellows who wants to take it up. And that's, would just love to know a case or an example of the ways that you see some of those ethics that Doug spoke to. So thinking collaboratively and public engagement, how you saw that affecting your work, playing out in your work, whether that's something you're still kind of thinking through as a methodology. So any of us, or anything you'd want to speak to around how those ethics might resonate with you and your work. Love to hear anything anybody wants to frame around that.
I can perhaps go. All right, so Doug, thank you a million for your presentation. I have so much I want to ask you about, but later, maybe in an email. And thank y'all. Thank to the rest of the presenters today. Okay, let's see. Working collaboratively and working with communities, I think has always been central to my work, in part because before I was in grad school, I was an organizer, right? So I saw the importance of working with community. And I think when I came in, I declared that I would actually translate all of my work. And then I realized that's actually a profession, like a full-time job, and like there's like professional, yeah. So I was like, what are ways in which I can like try to translate as much as possible so that folks that I work with can read it for the most part. But then also, what are some like material or other ways that I can work with communities? And so one thing that me and a dear friend have started trying to get off the ground, if you will, is like a digital archive of Black, Indigenous relation and thought, and like kind of comprise like a Google folder with translations in English, Spanish, and Portuguese, and hopefully in Indigenous languages, particularly where we work, which would be Benza and Nusavi, but then others throughout Mexico and throughout the region, so that everyone can have access to that, because otherwise it's a deep dive into the internet to find sources and whatnot. But also, you know, if folks are like, hey, you know, we need access to this official, government official or whatnot, we try to facilitate that as well. So yeah, I mean, those are like some little ways that I can say on here that I try to engage with community as much as possible.
Thanks, Ash. Appreciate you sharing that. That's really great. Anybody else? I hope these questions, I mean, I've learned a little bit about your work across the year, so I feel like I can think of all kinds of ways in which you all are engaging in these ethics.
I can go. I think thinking about these ethics really strengthened my like critiques of certain frameworks that I have to work in, because thinking about approaches to health in an individual versus community level are fundamentally different. And thinking of like working with a community who thinks as a community, as like a cohesive unit that share and divide decision-making processes and access and what health even is, versus kind of thinking about, you know, I have to think about my positionality as a Western trained scholar. And that is the information that has been presented to me. And that is the information that they were like, go do research in. And unfortunately for me, I didn't know what I was doing because I was an undergraduate. I wasn't even declared as an anthropologist prior to starting that work, which actually put me in a fortunate position because I wasn't guiding my questions. I was just there to like learn and understand. And I think that's been really helpful with community engagement. And that's been helpful in learning how to listen, because that's not necessarily something that everybody does. And I think it's something that we can all get better at, myself included. And so public engagement means who is my public? Who am I addressing? And what does engagement for them look like? And so thinking about that in terms of like developing my work, I didn't go in there thinking I was gonna learn about bees or thinking I was gonna study bees. I think I was gonna have to have this extensive knowledge of bees because I came in there as like skeletal biology background, human biology background. But that is what they wanted to talk about. And that was my responsibility to learn about and to care about and to like engage with. And so it's just kind of developing, you know, what that looks like. And we still talk on like WhatsApp and stuff. So they like keep me updated on like, what's going on in the community. So yeah, I think from a health perspective, really about like what even is health, you know, and who's saying what it is. And I think that, yeah, has been part of my work.
Thanks, Bobby. I know folks are needing to go, but any last questions, comments?
I'm especially curious about the thinking collaboratively. You know, what that looks for people. We usually don't see that part of the process. Yeah.
I didn't raise my hand, but I hope that I'm not.
Yeah, go.
I think that something that is really, one is that I came to this space wanting to further how does one do this collaborative work and deal with so many expectations, because organizing has its very different standards of work. And the other thing is that one thing that I really liked about performance studies is that it gives you, with what we've discussed and with me entering this native studies environment, is how to be very cognizant and very aware of the singularity of each of the voices that are intervening, and making always space to sort of show all the colors in a way. Even though the authorship of the articles and even though the voice that is speaking and articulating things is one's voice, I think that I've acquired other resources to point it out, to not be also formulaic or performative in the wrong sense, like just, oh, this is what you do when you want to do this, and then just be an evil person when you're not being public. So I've really enjoyed it, and I've enjoyed seeing how other people see it. So I've learned so much from people that I've heard speak, how they take their time, how they pace their speech, and yeah, I can say many more things, but it's been a huge part of my own work, and it has shaped the work itself. It's not something that is on top of, but it's something that shapes the themes as well, and the methods and the objectives, and what one is planning, like one's own research plan. So thanks again.
Thanks.
I wanted to really quickly talk to Doug about the point you made about thinking collaboratively, because it reminded me of, so with the beekeeping, they have a rotating basis of who takes care of the bees. And I really was interested in that, and like thought a lot about that, because even though like the families don't get along sometimes, and they have like complex dynamics, the bees is their shared interest and the health of the bees. And like there are two brothers in the community who haven't spoken in years over a family issue, and they will still do their part together, and if they have to, and like work to keep that flow going in that relationship in the community, which I think is like any family, but at a much like larger community scale within their like structures, and having a position of power as a landowner and such.
I love that so much.
Doug, you had a teaser in your slide about where we're going next. And I wondered if I could ask you about that.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of what I was getting at with the reference to an earlier case in 2005 and McGirt, right? So no need to go back over McGirt, but the earlier one that was more concerning over similar questions, right? Land buyback, what happens, the first case was the city of Sherrill versus New York, 2005. And it's the first time the Supreme Court has to consider the question of what happens when Native people actually can buy back land, right? They've never really considered this because it's not part of the calculus, right? So the idea is, for instance, Oneida Nation won a Supreme Court case in 1985 that said 250,000 acres of upstate New York is, in fact, still supposed to be Oneida land. It was illegally taken by false treaties, right? So there's, general claims to, stolen ancestral territory, but in this particular case, they're sitting on a Supreme Court victory, right? And so they're trying to mobilize that in some way. It's like, look, your court in 85 said all of this of upstate New York was taken on false pretenses, and we're supposed to get some kind of adequate settlement, right? That never comes. And so the Oneida Nation of New York, rather than Wisconsin, which I was talking about earlier, they basically get the idea of like, well, if it's within the territory the Supreme Court says is supposed to be ours, what if we just start buying it back, reservation or not, right? Whether it's inside the reservation or not, because their own territory there had shrunk to 32 acres, just ridiculously small. It's a neighborhood, right? Not enough to build a future on, right? And so basically they test the idea of, can we just buy back Syracuse block by block, right? Will it go that way? And the Supreme Court has to figure that out. Will it go that way, right? Can Oneida just start buying it back? And, and if it takes 300 years, right, pretty soon reconstitute it all. So the Supreme Court says, no, it's not going to work that way. Not at all. It has to be within the boundaries of whatever is your, reservation as it is. And Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, I repeat, RBG, the progressive RBG, relies on the doctrine of discovery and Johnson v. McIntosh for the argument that, well, this is all always actually ours, right? So title to the land, sovereignty over it, which is the basis of the US legal conception of things, right? Johnson v. McIntosh. Native people have the right to occupy lands, but they do not have title to them, right? So this is why it's held in trust, right? Because we are not grown up enough to have sovereign title of our own, right? So that idea, right? In 2005, the fact that there's questions of buyback and what this might look like, and RBG's inclination is, no. If we go back to, doctrine of discovery, this all looks, we have a clear claim to sovereignty here, right, over the land. The difference between that and what happens in McGirt, I think, to me, that what happens in that 15 years, and it also looks like, because RBG co-signed with Gorsuch and his majority opinion, and it honestly had the vibe to me of he gets the body of federal Indian law and policy more clearly than she does, and he must have been able to persuade over to her side of things. But that's an important shift. I mean, she was literally bringing up the doctrine of discovery. Let's if we were to think about what that is, that comes from like medieval papal authority, right? So for RGB to be like, no, we have the right, because of what the Pope said about you being heathens and all, right? That's the basis of that, right? And so she brings it up, right, as a valid legal principle in 2005. 2020, we get a really different kind of engagement from Neil Gorsuch, right? And that's what gives me a sense of, I think we're headed toward a much more serious and respectful engagement with our political institutions, right? And having folks like Deb Haaland in the position of Secretary of Interior doesn't change everything, right? But I do think it means that our institutions can get a more, respectful engagement. That to me, that looks like a sign. 15 years of actually a little bit of movement in the right direction.
Thanks.
Yeah. I know, long answer.
It's great. Any last comments or questions before we sign off and say goodbye? I want to give say one last thank you, and that's to Aaron Leary, who behind the scenes helped us with all the Zoom issues. Thank you, Aaron, for being another supporting CNAIR in yet another event. We really appreciate you, and it's always great to work with you. Thanks to Ash, Cordelia, Bobby, and Doug, and thanks to all of you for coming. It's so great to spend the afternoon with you and to hear you talk about your work, which I've just loved getting to know more about this year. Take care. We'll see you soon, hopefully in person. Bye, everybody.
Good to see you all. Take care.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.